Power has a way of making men forget who they really are, and sometimes it takes exactly 10 seconds to remind them. Griffin Voltaire owned half of Manhattan's elite fitness empire, a billion-dollar kingdom built on sweat, ambition, and the kind of ruthless confidence that comes from never being told no. In his world of marble gyms and celebrity clients, respect was measured in net worth, and strength was defined by bank statements. But in the gleaming corridors of his newest academy, where New York's wealthy came to play at being warriors, something was about to shatter the carefully constructed illusion of power. He was surrounded by everything money could buy, investors hanging on his every word, cameras capturing his success, a crowd ready to laugh at whatever joke he decided to make. The master of his domain, untouchable in his empire of steel and glass. What Griffin didn't know was that real strength often wears the most humble disguises, that true power sometimes mops floors in silence, carrying secrets that could topple kingdoms, that some men have walked through fires that would consume billionaires without leaving a trace. In the shadows of his pristine academy, someone was watching. Someone who knew the difference between playing warrior and being one. Someone whose hands had held more than cleaning supplies, whose shoulders had carried burdens that Griffin's privileged world couldn't even imagine. One moment of arrogance, one careless challenge thrown like a gauntlet at the feet of a man society had forgotten. One assumption that money and status could predict the outcome of any battle. In 10 seconds, everything Griffin believed about power, respect, and the natural order of his world would crumble. In 10 seconds, he would learn that some fights aren't won by the man with the most expensive training, but by the one with nothing left to lose. The question wasn't whether Griffin would fall, the question was whether he would survive what came after the fall. Because when you challenge a ghost from America's darkest secrets, when you humiliate a man the system tried to bury, when you mistake silence for weakness, you don't just lose a fight. You expose the corruption of an entire empire. Subscribe to the channel for more explosive stories that reveal the truth behind power, and don't forget to like the video if you're ready to see what happens when arrogance meets reality. Hit the bell to witness the moment everything changes. The cameras flashed like lightning as Griffin Voltaire stepped onto the pristine white mats of his newest academy in Manhattan's Upper East Side. At 38, he moved with the fluid confidence of a man who had never known defeat, in business or on the mat. His custom-tailored G bore his academy's logo in gold thread, and his black belt was worn with the casual arrogance of someone who viewed it as just another symbol of his dominance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Griffin announced to the crowd of investors, celebrities, and fitness influencers gathered for the grand opening, "Welcome to Voltaire Combat Academy, where champions are forged and legends are born." The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Griffin's empire of luxury martial arts academies had redefined how the wealthy approached fitness. With locations in Beverly Hills, Miami, and Chicago, his academies weren't just gyms, they were exclusive clubs where tech billionaires trained alongside movie stars, where venture capitalists paid $500 per session to learn Brazilian jiu-jitsu from world-class instructors. "Tonight, you're not just witnessing the opening of another gym," Griffin continued, his voice carrying the practiced charm of a man who had pitched to countless investors. "You're seeing the future of elite combat training. Here, we don't just build muscle, we build character, discipline, and the kind of mental toughness that separates leaders from followers." The crowd murmured approval. Among them stood Richard Blackstone, a defense contractor and major investor in Griffin's empire, whose own military background lent credibility to the academy's elite reputation. Sarah Chen, the tech mogul who had funded 3 of Griffin's previous locations, nodded appreciatively at the state-of-the-art equipment and luxurious amenities. Griffin gestured toward the main training area, where professional fighters and instructors were demonstrating advanced techniques. "Our philosophy is simple: excellence in all things. From our hand-selected instructors to our custom-designed equipment, everything here reflects the standard our clients deserve." What Griffin didn't mention was that maintaining those standards required an army of invisible workers who kept his empire spotless and functional. People like Darnell Washington, who had been quietly mopping the floors in the background since before dawn, ensuring that every surface gleamed for this important evening. At 42, Darnell was a large man with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of years of hard work. He moved through the academy with practiced efficiency, his dark uniform marking him as part of the cleaning crew that arrived before the members and left after they were gone. In Griffin's world, Darnell was furniture, necessary but invisible, present but unnoticed. "Mr. Voltaire," called out James Morrison, a hedge fund manager who owned a stake in the academy, I have to ask, how do you maintain such consistent quality across all your locations? Griffin smiled, the question playing perfectly into his prepared response. It starts with standards, James. In my academies, everything must be perfect. From the temperature of the water in our showers to the precise tension in our training equipment. Excellence isn't an accident, it's a system. As if on cue, Griffin's eyes fell on Darnell, who was methodically cleaning the corner of the mat area. The billionaire's expression shifted slightly, a spark of mischief crossing his features as he recognized an opportunity to demonstrate his point about systems and hierarchies. Take our cleaning crew, for example, Griffin said, his voice carrying just loud enough for the crowd to hear. These are the people who make it possible for our elite athletes to train in pristine conditions. They understand their role in maintaining our standards. A few people in the crowd glanced toward Darnell, who continued his work without acknowledging that he was being discussed. Griffin felt the familiar rush of power that came from being able to control every element of his environment, including the people in it. You know what I find fascinating about different types of strength? Griffin continued, warming to what he saw as an entertaining tangent. Everyone thinks they know what real power looks like. But true strength, the kind we teach here, it's refined, disciplined, technical. Richard Blackstone chuckled. As opposed to what, Griffin? Brute force? Exactly. Any man can be strong in the abstract. But can he perform under pressure? Can he execute technique when it matters? Can he maintain composure in front of an audience? Griffin's gaze returned to Darnell, and an idea began forming that would prove irresistible to his ego. Here was a perfect opportunity to demonstrate the superiority of trained skill over raw physicality, to show his wealthy audience the difference between his refined martial arts and common labor. In fact, Griffin said, his voice taking on the tone of a man about to make a bold demonstration, let me show you what I mean about the difference between real training and mere physical presence. The crowd sensed something interesting was about to happen. Conversations quieted, and all attention focused on Griffin, who was clearly building towards some kind of presentation. Darnell, Griffin called out, using a tone that was friendly but unmistakably commanding. Could you come over here for a moment? Darnell stopped mopping and looked up, his dark eyes meeting Griffin's for the first time that evening. There was something in his gaze, not defiance, exactly, but a quiet assessment that lasted just a moment too long for Griffin's comfort. Yes, sir? Darnell replied, his voice deep and measured. Griffin gestured toward the center of the mat, where the crowd had a clear view. I was just explaining to our guests about different types of strength. Mind helping me demonstrate something? The request was phrased politely, but everyone in the room understood it wasn't really a request. Griffin was the billionaire owner, Darnell was an employee, and refusing would mean looking for another job tomorrow. What kind of demonstration? Darnell asked, setting down his mop and moving toward the center of the mat with surprising grace for such a large man. Griffin smiled, feeling the crowd's anticipation building. Nothing too intense, just a friendly demonstration of technique versus, well, let's call it natural ability. Several people in the audience exchanged glances, sensing the setup that was coming. This was classic Griffin Voltaire, turning everything into a teachable moment that reinforced his superiority and entertained his wealthy friends. You see, Griffin explained to the crowd while keeping his eyes on Darnell, martial arts isn't about size or strength. It's about leverage, timing, technique. These are things that take years to master, years that most people. He gestured casually toward Darnell. Most people in other professions simply don't have. Darnell stood in the center of the mat, his expression neutral but his posture relaxed. He didn't look intimidated or uncomfortable, which surprised Griffin slightly. Most employees would be nervous about being put on the spot like this in front of such an important crowd. So what do you say, big guy? Griffin asked with the kind of smile that was meant to be disarming but carried an edge of challenge. Want to help me show these folks what real training can accomplish? The crowd was fully engaged now, sensing drama. Camera phones came out, and conversations stopped entirely. This wasn't just a demonstration anymore. It was entertainment, the kind of spectacle that would make for great social media content. Darnell looked around the room, taking in the crowd of wealthy onlookers, the cameras, the expectant faces waiting to see him humiliated for their amusement. His gaze lingered for a moment on Richard Blackstone, whose face showed particular interest in the proceedings. You want to spar? Darnell asked simply. Griffin laughed, the sound carrying just enough condescension to make his point clear. Let's call it a friendly demonstration of technique. Nothing serious, just enough to show the difference between trained skill and, he paused, searching for the right phrase, natural physical gifts. And if I say no? The question caught Griffin off guard. In his world, employees didn't negotiate with billionaires. They said, "Yes, sir," and did what they were told. "Well," Griffin said, his smile becoming slightly forced, "I'd hope you'd want to be a team player. This is all in good fun, after all." The threat was implicit, but clear. Darnell could play along with Griffin's entertainment, or he could find himself unemployed. The crowd understood the dynamic too, and some faces showed discomfort at the obvious power imbalance being exploited. Darnell was quiet for several long seconds, and Griffin began to wonder if he would have to make the threat more explicit. Then Darnell nodded once. "All right," he said, "let's do it." Griffin felt a surge of satisfaction. This was going exactly as planned, a harmless demonstration that would reinforce social hierarchies while providing entertainment for his investors. He would go easy on the man, of course, just enough technique to make his point without actually hurting anyone. "Excellent," Griffin said, beginning to stretch his shoulders. "Now, I want everyone to watch closely. You're about to see why years of dedicated training will always overcome raw physical presence." As the crowd formed a circle around the mat, Griffin felt the familiar confidence that came from being in complete control of his environment. He had the better training, the home field advantage, and an audience that expected him to win. This wasn't really a fight, it was a performance, with a predetermined outcome that would reinforce everything his wealthy audience believed about merit, training, and natural hierarchy. What Griffin couldn't have known was that some lessons can't be bought with money. Some training happens in places where the stakes are life and death, not social media likes. And some men carry knowledge that no amount of wealth can purchase. In 30 seconds, Griffin Voltaire would learn the difference between playing warrior in a luxury gym and being forged in the fires of real combat. But for now, he stood confidently on his pristine white mats, surrounded by his admiring audience, completely unaware that he was about to become the victim of his own arrogance. Griffin Voltaire moved to the center of his pristine mat with the confident swagger of a man who had never lost a fight that mattered. The crowd of investors, celebrities, and fitness influencers formed a loose circle around the demonstration area, their phones already recording what they assumed would be an amusing display of wealth and power over the working class. "Now, before we begin," Griffin announced to his audience, "I want everyone to understand what you're about to witness. This isn't about humiliating anyone, it's about demonstrating the difference between trained technique and raw physicality." Darnell Washington stood across from him, still wearing his dark cleaning uniform, his large frame relaxed and his expression unreadable. At 6'4" and clearly strong from years of physical labor, he looked like he could handle himself in a street fight. But this wasn't the street, this was Griffin's domain, with Griffin's rules, in front of Griffin's people. "The beautiful thing about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu," Griffin continued, beginning to circle slowly on the mat, "is that it proves intelligence trumps strength every time. Leverage beats muscle, strategy defeats aggression." Several people in the crowd murmured agreement. Sarah Chen, the tech mogul, was filming with professional-grade equipment, already imagining the social media content this would generate. Richard Blackstone watched with the keen interest of someone who understood combat, though his military background was in management rather than front-line fighting. "Ready when you are," Griffin said to Darnell, dropping into a classic fighting stance. His movements were fluid and practiced, showing years of expensive training under world-class instructors. Darnell simply stood there, his hands at his sides, looking completely relaxed. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. Griffin's confidence surged. The man wasn't even taking a fighting stance. This would be easier than he'd thought. "Absolutely. Don't worry. I'll go easy on you." A few people in the crowd chuckled at Griffin's casual dominance. This was exactly what they expected, the natural order being demonstrated with technical precision. "All right then," Darnell said, his voice so calm it was almost conversational. "Let's get this over with." Griffin moved first, stepping in with a perfectly executed takedown attempt that should have put Darnell on the ground immediately. It was a textbook technique, the kind of move that had impressed countless sparring partners and won him tournaments at the amateur level. But Darnell wasn't there. In one fluid motion that seemed to defy physics, the larger man sidestepped Griffin's attack, grabbed him by the wrist and shoulder, and used Griffin's own momentum against him. The movement was so fast, so precise, so devastatingly effective that it took the crowd several seconds to understand what had happened. Griffin Voltaire, billion-dollar gym empire owner and supposed martial arts expert, was airborne. He hit the mat with a sound like thunder, his expensive G twisting around him as all the air exploded from his lungs. But Darnell wasn't finished. Before Griffin could even process what was happening, Darnell had followed him to the ground, applying a submission hold that trapped Griffin's arm and shoulder in a position that made any movement excruciatingly painful. The entire sequence had taken less than 10 seconds. The crowd stood in stunned silence, phones still recording, but no one quite believing what they had just witnessed. Griffin tried to move, tried to escape, but every attempt sent shooting pain through his shoulder and arm. Darnell's hold was perfect, not brutal or angry, but technically flawless and absolutely inescapable. "Tap out," Darnell said quietly, his voice carrying no emotion, no triumph, no anger, just a simple statement of fact. Griffin's face was pressed against the mat, his arm trapped in a position that would dislocate his shoulder if he moved wrong. The pain was intense, but worse was the humiliation of being completely dominated in front of his most important investors and friends. "Tap out," Darnell repeated, applying just enough pressure to make Griffin understand that resistance was futile. Griffin tapped frantically against the mat, the universal signal of submission. Immediately, Darnell released the hold and stood up, stepping back to give Griffin space to recover. The silence in the room was deafening. Griffin rolled onto his back, gasping for air and cradling his shoulder, which felt like it might be dislocated. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his expensive gi was wrinkled and twisted, and his face was red with exertion and embarrassment. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered from the crowd. "What the hell was that?" Griffin struggled to sit up, his entire body shaking from the shock of what had just happened. In 30 years of martial arts training, in hundreds of sparring sessions with elite fighters, no one had ever dominated him so completely or so quickly. Darnell walked calmly to where he had left his cleaning supplies, as if nothing significant had just occurred. The crowd parted in front of him, everyone suddenly very aware that they had completely misjudged the quiet man in the janitor's uniform. "Wait," Griffin managed to croak, his voice hoarse from having the wind knocked out of him. "Wait a minute." Darnell stopped and turned back, his expression still calm and unreadable. "What? How did you?" Griffin couldn't form a complete sentence. His world had just been turned upside down, and he needed answers. Instead of explaining, Darnell reached into his equipment bag and pulled out a small black wallet. He opened it and held up an identification card for the crowd to see. "Staff Sergeant Darnell Washington," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "Delta Force, United States Army, retired." The crowd exploded into shocked murmurs and gasps. Delta Force. Everyone knew that name. It was the most elite special operations unit in the American military, comprised of soldiers who were legends even among other elite fighters. But Darnell wasn't finished. He reached back into his bag and pulled out a small wooden box. Opening it revealed a collection of military medals and decorations that made several people in the crowd audibly gasp. "2 Bronze Stars," Darnell said, his voice still calm but now carrying a weight that made everyone listen intently. "Purple Heart, Combat Action Badge, and a few others that I'm not allowed to talk about." Richard Blackstone's face had gone completely white. As a defense contractor, he knew exactly what those decorations meant. The man they had just watched mop floors was a legitimate American war hero, someone who had fought and bled for his country in ways that most people couldn't even imagine. Griffin was still on the mat, staring up at Darnell with a mixture of shock, pain, and growing horror as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. "You wanted to know what I could do," Darnell said, closing the metal box and putting it back in his bag. "Now you know." He shouldered his cleaning supplies and walked toward the exit, leaving behind a room full of wealthy, powerful people who suddenly felt very small and very foolish. "Wait," Sarah Chen called out, her phone still recording. "Sergeant Washington, can you tell us why you're working as a janitor? I mean, with your background." Darnell stopped at the door and turned back one final time. For the first time that evening, his calm facade cracked slightly, revealing a flash of pain and anger that made everyone in the room take a step back. "Because when you report war crimes committed by your commanding officers," he said, his voice heavy with years of suppressed rage, "they find ways to destroy your life. They make sure you never work in your field again. They spread lies about your service record until no one will hire you for anything better than cleaning up other people's messes." The silence that followed was profound. Everyone in the room understood that they had just witnessed something far more significant than a simple fight. They had seen a system of injustice laid bare, watched a hero reduced to invisibility by corruption and cover-ups. The same system that failed me, Darnell continued, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Richard Blackstone, is the same system that some of you profit from every day. With that, he walked out of the academy, leaving behind a room full of shaken investors and a billionaire gym owner still sitting on the mat in shock. Griffin finally managed to stand up, his shoulder throbbing and his ego shattered beyond repair. Around him, his carefully invited audience was buzzing with excited conversation, but he could see in their eyes that everything had changed. The story they would tell about this evening wouldn't be about his successful academy opening. It would be about the night a janitor destroyed a billionaire's reputation in 10 seconds. "Someone get that on social media yet?" James Morrison asked, his hedge fund manager instincts already calculating the financial implications of what they had just witnessed. "Already uploading," Sarah Chen replied, her fingers flying across her phone screen. "This is going to go viral within the hour." Griffin felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. In his world, image was everything. Respect was currency, and he had just been bankrupted in front of cameras that were already sharing his humiliation with the world. But as the crowd began to disperse, talking excitedly about what they had witnessed, Griffin couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Darnell's words about reporting war crimes and being destroyed by the system echoed in his mind, along with the way Richard Blackstone had gone pale when the medals were revealed. There was more to this story, much more, and Griffin had the sinking feeling that his 10 seconds of humiliation on the mat were nothing compared to what was coming next. In the parking garage beneath his billion-dollar empire, Darnell Washington packed his cleaning supplies into his beaten-up Honda Civic and drove home to his studio apartment in Queens. He had kept his mouth shut for 5 years, accepting his exile from the life he had earned through blood and sacrifice. But something about being humiliated in front of cameras, about being treated like entertainment for people who had never risked anything for anyone, had finally broken his silence. The truth was about to come out, and when it did, it would destroy more than just Griffin Voltaire's reputation. It would expose the corruption that reached from the battlefields of Afghanistan to the boardrooms of Manhattan, revealing how heroes were discarded when they became inconvenient to the powerful men who profited from their sacrifice. By 6 a.m. the next morning, Griffin Voltaire's world was burning down, one social media share at a time. The video of his humiliation had exploded across every platform imaginable. Sarah Chen's high-quality footage showed every devastating second in crystal clarity: Griffin's arrogant setup, Darnell's lightning-fast takedown, and the billionaire's shocked face as he tapped out in submission. But it was the aftermath that really captured the internet's attention, the moment when a humble janitor revealed himself to be a decorated war hero. Billionaire gets destroyed by janitor in 10 seconds. Watch. Delta Force veteran shows racist gym owner what real strength looks like. The most satisfying 10 seconds you'll see today. Rich bully gets humbled. The hashtags were multiplying by the hour. Justice for Darnell, real hero, privileged force servant, Delta Force janitor. Griffin's phone had been buzzing non-stop with calls from reporters, investors, and crisis management firms. He'd stopped answering after the 15th journalist asked him to comment on exploiting veterans for entertainment. Sitting in his Manhattan penthouse at 7 a.m., still in his bathrobe with his left arm in a sling from his dislocated shoulder, Griffin watched his reputation crumble in real time. The video had over 2 million views and climbing. Worse, people were digging into the story, asking questions about how a Delta Force veteran ended up mopping floors. His phone buzzed with a text from Richard Blackstone. "We need to talk. Immediately. This is bigger than you realize." Griffin ignored it. Richard had been calling since midnight, but Griffin was too busy trying to control the damage to his own reputation. His PR team was in full crisis mode, crafting statements about misunderstandings and mutual respect, but every response only seemed to fuel more outrage. The comments on the viral videos were brutal. "This is everything wrong with America right now. A war hero cleaning toilets while rich kids play fighter. Look at his face when he sees those medals. Dude knew he messed up bad. How do you go from saving lives in Delta Force to mopping floors? Something stinks about this story. This man fought for our freedom, and we let him become invisible. Shame on all of us." By noon, major news outlets had picked up the story. CNN ran a segment titled, "From Hero to Janitor, the Fall of a Delta Force Veteran." MSNBC interviewed military experts who spoke about the difficulties veterans faced when trying to report misconduct. Fox News, somewhat predictably, focused on Griffin's gym empire and its impact on the local economy. But it was the investigative journalists who worried Griffin the most. They were asking questions about Darnell's military service, about why he'd been discharged, about what had happened to destroy his career, and some of them were starting to connect dots that Griffin desperately wanted to remain unconnected. Mr. Voltaire, his crisis management consultant, Linda Martinez, said during an emergency video call, "We need to get ahead of this story. The internet has already decided you're the villain. We need to show contrition, make amends, demonstrate that you've learned from this experience." "What are you suggesting?" Griffin asked, though he already knew he wouldn't like the answer. "Public apology, immediately, and a significant gesture towards Sergeant Washington. A job offer, maybe. Something that shows you recognize his value and want to make things right." Griffin's stomach churned. The idea of publicly apologizing to a man who had humiliated him in front of his most important investors was almost unbearable. But his stock in publicly traded companies was already dropping, and 3 major sponsors had pulled their support from his Academy franchise. "Find him," Griffin said finally. "Set up a meeting. I'll make this right." What Griffin didn't know was that Darnell Washington was already in the spotlight, and he wasn't interested in private meetings or quiet settlements. That afternoon, Darnell sat across from Anderson Cooper in CNN's New York studio, still wearing the simple clothes that marked him as working class, but carrying himself with the dignity that no amount of wealth could purchase. "Sergeant Washington," Cooper began, "thank you for joining us. I think everyone wants to know, how does a decorated Delta Force veteran end up working as a janitor?" Darnell was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "When you serve your country, Mr. Cooper, you do it because you believe in something bigger than yourself. You believe that truth matters, that honor matters, that protecting the innocent is worth any sacrifice. But something changed that for you. In 2018, I was part of a mission in Afghanistan. Operation Fallen Angel. My team and I were sent to extract civilians from a village that intelligence said was about to be overrun by Taliban forces." Cooper leaned forward, sensing that this was the heart of the story. "What we found when we got there," Darnell continued, "was that the intelligence was wrong. The village wasn't in danger from the Taliban, it was in danger from our own forces. Contractors working with certain military officials were using the chaos of war to cover up arms dealing and drug trafficking." Griffin, watching from his penthouse, felt his blood turn to ice. "We had 2 choices," Darnell said. "Follow orders that we knew would result in civilian deaths to cover up corruption, or do the right thing and protect innocent people. And you chose to protect the civilians. My team and I chose to do our jobs. We protected those people. But when we reported what we had seen, when we tried to expose the corruption," Darnell's voice hardened, "that's when we learned that some of the people giving the orders had financial interests in seeing that corruption continue." Cooper's expression grew more serious. "You're talking about war crimes, Sergeant. Cover-ups that go to the highest levels of military command. I'm talking about 44 good soldiers who died because they were sent into an ambush. Soldiers who were sacrificed to protect business interests. I'm talking about a system that destroys anyone who tries to tell the truth about what really happened." The interview was being broadcast live, and Griffin could see the viewer numbers climbing in real time. This wasn't just about his humiliation anymore. This was about systemic corruption, about heroes being silenced, about the military-industrial complex that connected battlefield profits to Manhattan boardrooms. His phone rang. Richard Blackstone again. This time, Griffin answered. "You need to shut him up," Richard said without preamble. "Whatever it takes, offer him money, a job, anything. But this interview stops now. It's live television, Richard. I can't just..." "Do you have any idea what he's talking about? Operation Fallen Angel? That was one of our operations, Griffin. Blackstone Defense had contracts for that entire sector. If he starts naming names, if he starts talking about specific deals..." Griffin felt the pieces falling into place. Richard Blackstone wasn't just an investor in his gyms. He was part of the military corruption that had destroyed Darnell's life. The same man who had watched Darnell get humiliated for entertainment was one of the people who had profited from sending him and his team into an ambush. "How long have you known?" Griffin asked. "Known what?" "How long have you known who Darnell Washington was? When you invested in my gyms, when you watched him mop floors in my academies, did you know you were profiting from the work of a man whose life you had destroyed?" Richard's silence was answer enough. On television, Anderson Cooper was asking Darnell about his life after the military. "They made sure I couldn't work," Darnell said simply. "My security clearance was revoked." My service record was classified in ways that made it impossible for me to prove my qualifications to civilian employers. They spread rumors about my mental health, my reliability, my patriotism. Within a year, I went from being a decorated special operations soldier to being unemployable. And that's how you ended up working as a janitor? That's how I ended up invisible, which is exactly what they wanted. Can't tell the truth if no one will listen to you. Cooper turned to the camera. When we come back, Sergeant Washington will tell us about the documents that prove his allegations and why he's finally ready to speak out after 5 years of silence. Griffin turned off the television, his mind racing. This was no longer about damage control for his reputation. This was about survival. If Darnell had documents, if he could prove the corruption, if he could connect Richard Blackstone's defense contracts to the deaths of American soldiers, the entire empire that Griffin had built with Richard's money would collapse. Worse, Griffin himself could face criminal charges as an accessory after the fact, profiting from blood money while employing the very man whose life had been destroyed to generate those profits. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Voltaire, this is Darnell Washington. I think we should talk. But this time, we do it on my terms." Griffin stared at the message, realizing that his 10 seconds of humiliation on the mat had been just the opening move in a much larger game. Darnell Washington wasn't just a war hero who had been forgotten by society. He was a man with nothing left to lose and evidence that could topple an entire network of corruption. Outside his penthouse windows, Griffin could see protesters beginning to gather on the street below. Veterans, activists, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by Darnell's story and outraged by the systemic injustice it represented. The billionaire who had once controlled every aspect of his environment was about to learn what it felt like to be truly powerless. Because when you build an empire on foundations of corruption and exploitation, it only takes one honest man to bring the whole thing crashing down. And Darnell Washington was done being quiet. 3 weeks after the viral video that destroyed Griffin Voltaire's reputation, Darnell Washington walked through the marble halls of the United States Capitol wearing his full Delta Force dress uniform. The sight of the decorated veteran striding purposefully toward the Senate hearing room drew respectful nods from senators, staffers, and tourists alike. But Darnell's mind was focused on only one thing: the testimony he was about to give that would expose 5 years of carefully hidden corruption. Griffin watched the live broadcast from his nearly empty penthouse, most of his furniture already sold to pay mounting legal fees. His gym empire had collapsed within days of Darnell's CNN interview. Sponsors fled, investors demanded their money back, and 3 state attorneys general had launched investigations into his business practices. But the financial ruin was nothing compared to what was about to happen in that hearing room. "The Committee on Armed Services will come to order," announced Senator Patricia Morrison, the committee chairwoman. "Today we hear testimony regarding Operation Fallen Angel and allegations of systematic corruption within our military contracting system." The hearing room was packed beyond capacity. Veterans organizations had mobilized from across the country to support Darnell. Major news networks carried the proceedings live. Even members of Congress who weren't on the committee had found excuses to be present for what everyone knew would be historic testimony. "Sergeant Washington," Senator Morrison began, "thank you for your service to our nation, and thank you for your courage in coming forward. Please tell this committee, in your own words, what you witnessed in Afghanistan." Darnell adjusted the microphone and looked directly into the camera, knowing that millions of Americans were watching. "Senators, members of Congress, fellow Americans," he began, his voice steady and clear. "My name is Staff Sergeant Darnell Washington, and I'm here to tell you about the night 44 of America's finest soldiers died not for freedom, not for democracy, but to protect the financial interests of men who saw war as a business opportunity." The room was completely silent. On March 15, 2018, my Delta Force team was ordered to evacuate civilians from a village called Qadir in Kandahar province. Our intelligence indicated imminent Taliban attack, but when we arrived, we discovered something very different. Darnell reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder of documents. What we found was a staging area for illegal arms transfers, American weapons and military equipment being sold to Taliban forces by contractors working with corrupt military officials. The civilians we were sent to evacuate were actually arms dealers. The Taliban attack was supposed to be cover for moving the final shipment. Senator James Bradley, a Republican from Texas and former military officer himself, leaned forward. "Sergeant Washington, these are extremely serious allegations. Do you have evidence to support these claims?" "Yes, sir, I do," Darnell held up the folder. Communications, financial records, shipping manifests, photographs. Everything needed to prove that American soldiers were being used as cover for treasonous profiteering. Griffin felt sick watching Darnell methodically present evidence that he knew would destroy Richard Blackstone and everyone connected to him, including Griffin himself. My team and I faced a choice, Darnell continued. Follow orders that we knew would result in American weapons being used to kill American soldiers, or do what we swore to do when we put on this uniform, protect our country and our fellow soldiers. What did you choose? Senator Morrison asked. We chose to be soldiers instead of criminals. We secured the weapons, arrested the dealers, and prepared a full report for our commanding officers. Darnell's voice hardened. That's when we learned that our commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Webb, was not just aware of the operation, he was being paid to facilitate it. And when we refused to falsify our report, when we insisted on exposing the corruption, that's when 44 good soldiers were sent to die. The hearing room erupted in gasps and shocked murmurs. Several senators looked physically ill. Webb sent Alpha Team into an ambush 2 days later, Darnell said, his voice breaking for the first time. Told them they were hunting high-value targets. Instead, they walked into a kill zone that Webb's Taliban contacts had prepared specifically for them. 44 soldiers who would have reported the weapons trafficking. 44 heroes who died to protect a lie. Senator Bradley was reading through the documents that Darnell had submitted. Sergeant Washington, these financial records show payments from Blackstone Defense Corporation to offshore accounts controlled by Colonel Webb. Are you alleging that this private defense contractor orchestrated the murder of American soldiers? I'm not alleging it, Senator. I'm proving it. Griffin's phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, but now it rang with a number he recognized, Richard Blackstone. Griffin, you have to help me. Richard's voice was panicked. They're going to arrest me. The FBI is outside my office right now. You know, I was just trying to build a business. I never meant for soldiers to die. Griffin hung up without responding. Whatever loyalty he'd felt to his business partner had died when he learned that Richard had knowingly employed and profited from the suffering of the very man whose life he had destroyed. On television, Darnell was continuing his testimony. When my team tried to report these crimes through proper channels, we were told that our evidence was classified and that speaking about it would be treason. Our security clearances were revoked. Our service records were sealed. False reports were filed questioning our mental fitness and reliability. And that's how you ended up working as a janitor? Senator Morrison asked gently. Ma'am, I spent 15 years serving this country. I earned 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and the respect of every soldier I ever served with. But when I tried to tell the truth about Operation Fallen Angel, I became unemployable overnight. The same system that trained me to fight for justice destroyed my life for trying to uphold it. Darnell paused, looking directly into the camera again. For 5 years, I cleaned floors in buildings owned by Richard Blackstone's business associates. For 5 years, I was forced to be invisible while the men who profited from my brother's deaths lived in luxury. I was sent to die in silence, and still had to clean the floors of those who profited from it. The phrase echoed through the hearing room and across social media instantaneously. Within minutes, "sent to die in silence" was trending worldwide. Senator Morrison called for a brief recess, but Darnell wasn't finished. Senators, I have one final piece of evidence to present. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small metal object that glinted under the hearing room lights. This is a piece of shrapnel from the IED that killed Alpha Team. It's from an American-made weapon, sold through the trafficking network that Colonel Webb and Blackstone Defense were operating. My brothers died from weapons that they were sent to protect. The emotional impact was devastating. Several people in the gallery were openly crying, including members of Congress. I kept this piece of metal for 5 years, waiting for the day when I could tell America the truth about how 44 heroes really died. That day is today. The hearing continued for 6 more hours, with Darnell methodically presenting evidence that exposed a corruption network reaching from battlefield contractors to Pentagon officials to investment firms on Wall Street. By the end of his testimony, it was clear that multiple criminal investigations would follow, and that dozens of people would face charges ranging from fraud to treason. Griffin watched it all from his empty penthouse, understanding that his life as he'd known it was over. But strangely, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: relief. The weight of unknowingly participating in such evil was finally being lifted. 6 months later, Richard Blackstone was sentenced to life in prison for treason and conspiracy in the deaths of American soldiers. Colonel Webb and 12 other military officials received similar sentences. Griffin himself was sentenced to 5 years for money laundering and profiteering, though his cooperation with investigators earned him a reduced sentence. The Voltaire Academy chain was liquidated, with all proceeds going to a victim compensation fund. But more importantly, the facilities were converted into rehabilitation and job training centers for veterans, run by a foundation that Darnell established with his lawsuit settlement money. On the 1-year anniversary of his viral confrontation with Griffin, Darnell stood in the main training room of what had once been Voltaire Combat Academy, Manhattan. The space had been transformed into the Memorial Center for Military Justice, providing free legal services, job training, and support services for veterans dealing with the challenges of civilian life. "Sergeant Washington," asked a young reporter, "do you ever regret that night when you fought Griffin Voltaire? Some people say you could have handled the situation differently." Darnell smiled, the first genuinely happy expression many people had ever seen from him. "That night wasn't about fighting Griffin Voltaire," he said. "That night was about refusing to be invisible anymore. Sometimes you have to let people see who you really are before you can change anything." Around him, dozens of veterans were learning new skills, getting legal help with benefits claims, and finding the support they needed to rebuild their lives. The 44 Memorial Wall displayed photos and stories of the Alpha Team soldiers who had died in Afghanistan, ensuring that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. "The real fight was never on that mat," Darnell continued. "The real fight was against a system that discards heroes when they become inconvenient. And that fight isn't over yet." As he spoke, Darnell looked up at a banner hanging from the ceiling. "Memorial 44, never forgotten, never silenced." Griffin Voltaire had challenged a janitor to a fight as a joke, expecting 10 seconds of entertainment for his wealthy friends. Instead, he had unleashed a reckoning that exposed corruption reaching the highest levels of American power, brought justice for 44 murdered soldiers, and transformed a forgotten hero into a symbol of resistance against institutional evil. The man who had been forced to clean up other people's messes had finally cleaned up the biggest mess of all, a system that valued profit over honor, silence over truth, and wealth over the lives of those who served. In his small apartment in Queens, Darnell kept that piece of shrapnel on his dresser, not as a reminder of pain, but as a promise that as long as he drew breath, the truth would never be buried again, and that no hero would ever have to die in silence while their killers lived in luxury. Sometimes 10 seconds is all it takes to change the world. Sometimes a single moment of courage can topple an empire built on lies. And sometimes the most powerful fight isn't about who's stronger, it's about who's willing to stand up and speak the truth, no matter what the cost. The end? A story about the courage to fight injustice even when the odds seem impossible, about honoring those who serve by refusing to let their sacrifice be exploited, and about the power of truth to bring down even the mightiest corruption. Because real strength isn't measured in belts or bank accounts, it's measured in the willingness to stand up for what's right, even when you're standing alone.